the Erika Nelson tour guide.
I don't know. Could be.
So.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Good, you guys?
I think let me know.
Rolling.
All right. Well, hi guys. Oh my goodness, it's so good to see you. I love being here. I love looking at these art sites. And for anybody who's been involved with these art sites, we all know what horrible, contrite monsters they can be. They don't stay where you put them. They're not built to any architectural standard other than pure expression. And that is what's always driven me to these sites, and that's sort of what has driven my explorations up to this point, but also how I got involved in starting to work in preservation of these things, because nobody else will touch them. They're not in an art museum. They're not historic preservation. They're in the gap in between. So the standards don't always apply, because these were real people making real amazing things with whatever they had on hand. So I was asked to talk a little bit about that, but also talk about my own work. So you're gonna get the whirlwind guide to how I got here. And you might recognize me by the crazy hair and the screaming, banging on my little drum, wearing a Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox t-shirt from Bemidji, Minnesota. And that's because my grandparents on one side were from Bemidji, so I knew that if I saw Paul and Babe out the window, we were going to go see Grandma and Grandpa Nelson. And if I saw the 8-ball water tower, we were going to go see my other grandparents, the Sappington side. So I thought, growing up, that this is how people navigate. You see it coming out the window, and you know who you're going to see, because the land was littered with these giant things. Sadly, I found out that that wasn't true. And when I grew up to be an adult, I went down a very sad path of corporate animation for Fox News. And then I realized that I couldn't do that for the rest of my life, so I sold everything I owned. I moved into a bus that I purchased from a public transportation company and decided to just reconnect to these things that I love so much. So I traveled with a paper atlas. This atlas was one where I would circle all the big things, and you can kind of see all of those circles in Wisconsin. And that's how I traveled. I would just go from circle to circle to circle. I also had squares around free camping sites. And so I lived full-time on the road for 2 years. Eventually passing through Kansas to this site that I remembered from grad school, the Garden of Eden. And it was like, yes! This is the kind of stuff I want to see. This is the stuff that I was not taught about in art school, but is actually art affecting people where they are in the neighborhoods where they live. And it was like, this is the other set of circles on my map. So Houston's, look at this before development. Oh my goodness. The Beer Can House, or the Miner's Hat restaurant in Idaho, shaped that way to show that miners didn't need to clean up to get a hot meal. They were welcome there. Or traveling to Wall Drug to see the big dinosaur. This ended up being how I would map out my routes and how I would start collecting stories. And the epiphany came for me at a certain point when I was at the world's largest ball of twine. And they didn't have good replicas or souvenirs of the twine. They just had a ping pong ball wrapped in normal sized twine. It was like, that's not good enough. So I started making my own replicas of these things that meant so much to me. And because I was living on the road and I wanted to tell people about what I was seeing and also wanted to get directions to the next big thing, that's how I started making the world's largest collection, the world's smallest versions of the world's largest things. Which I will parse out. I also decided that since this living arrangement was taking me a bunch of places, but I also wanted to collect and tell stories, I decided to paint my bus into a mobile museum that houses the world's largest collection of the world's smallest versions of the world's largest things. So I painted it while I was living in the desert. Usually I would camp for about a week in a spot and get a couple colors done, move off to the next one, get another colors, until I ended up with the whole thing painted. I did not know that I was making an art car until I was at Salvation Mountain and ran into Rocket Bob at a filling station, and he was like, well, did you know that you had an art car? I was like, well, I know I painted my bus. He's like, no, you've got an art car, and there's an art car parade in Houston, and you should go to it. And that was the first time that I knew that the Orange Show wasn't just the Orange Show, but also had this whole other encompassing thing around it. So that's really how I got involved in not just the outsider art environment, but the art car community, was through this inaugural World's Largest Collection, the World's Smallest Versions of the World's Largest Things. Now, most of you already know what it's made up of, but we'll parse it out. I go to the site of a World's Largest Thing. Once I've seen it with my own eyes, you can't just Google them, because everybody can Google. You have to go see it. Then I make the world's smallest version of that world's largest thing, add it to the collection, and since I've been doing this now for, oh my goodness, 20 years? Wow! I now have the world's largest collection of those world's smallest versions of those world's largest things. So the first time that I would have come to Houston would have been in the stripy bus, and those displays in the windows doesn't make for a good museum while it's moving, but when it's parked, it is always open for view. And I just kept traveling the US with these. I would go art site to art site, camp as much as possible, but eventually I ended up settling down in the middle of Kansas. One of my very first tours was of California, and my first big camping spot was at Salvation Mountain when Leonard was still building. And I fell in love with him, not just because he was awesome, but because he had a small replica of his own mountain that I think he later sent to Baltimore's Visionary Art Museum. This was one of the last photos I got to take of him. So anytime from then on that I would go out to California, I'd always spend at least 2 days with Leonard. And this would have been Christmas Day, I think 2014 would have been maybe the last time that I got to see him. But this too was the first time that I got to really see not just a site, but know the artist and see their love and vision for it. And this is what people are supposed to be making. This is the art that should be everywhere. This is the art that should be celebrated, because it's uncontrollable, it's gushy, it's everything that you've been told not to do, like, oh, that'll never last. Who cares? Leonard Knight was the one who really flipped that button for me into high gear of do it every single day that you can, because this is a gift. So he really gave me the fortitude to just keep going on these alternate paths. And every once in a while I stray into the normal world, but I usually get my bearings again and go off onto a tangent and create a new museum. So inaugural site was of California, world's largest. There's the Cabazon dinosaurs. There's a world's largest olive from Lindsay, California, and you'll notice that hole is just about head size. I did stick my head in it. I did not realize that my nose was going to act as a locking mechanism and sprang back out so I couldn't get my head out for a good period of time. And then when I finally extracted myself by blowing snot for lubrication to get my head out, I realized that I still needed to gather some info, which is usually the adjacent property. So I went over to the cafe, and everybody had seen me do this thing. But were happy to tell me about that olive, and I got a free slice of pie. World's largest box of raisins, also from California. And that bus toured for quite a while until it became no longer sustainable because it only got 7 to 8 miles per gallon. And after a while, even if you're using that as a living space, it doesn't work. So art car number 2 ended up being Scout. It was about dinosaurs sinking down into the tar pits, but there were still paintings of world's largest things along one side, Combat and Genericon on the other, and the 2 bouncy horses in the back had the running lights installed, so there were blinker bulbs in their butts, so left turn, left butt, right turn, right butt would blink, and they would sort of gallop along as I scouted out the next world's largest thing. So I used that one for quite a while. It went East Coast, West Coast, North Coast, South Coast. Here it is at Lucy the Margate Elephant in New Jersey, or on the very last restoration project, I ended up getting a new vehicle once the bus finally died, and I knew that the little pickup was starting to die, so I ended up purchasing a Jeep, and that too ended up getting inaugurated into these endless road trips of meeting Burroughs and Oatman or going to wigwam villages in Holbrook. But it didn't take long for that one too to become an art car, and ended up being a mix of the little scout vehicle, but also a big map of what's large where to help tell the story of these world's largest, and displays in the windows, kind of like that old bus, but with much better gas mileage. So I traveled with that one for a while. Each of these road trips would end up with not just replicas, but also some artwork involved. Getting to see the world's largest John Waters at Baltimore Artcade, or the world's largest Duncan Fife chair in somewhere in the Carolinas, or the Longaberger Business Building, which is a giant basket. You can see the handles. If you go inside in the atrium and look up, the handles meet up in the sky. Might still be for sale, so you too could live in a world's largest thing. And I keep going back to these as markers. So every time that I go back and photograph again. I see what's changed. And I realized that this ended up being a sort of important record of roadside attractions, but also starting with these artist-built environments. So this was the last trip out to LA was to see Rove McManus. And on the way, it's always a road trip because I go and see the big things to see how they're doing. And this is the closest I'll ever get to Gary Busey. I was already telling this story, but Rove is a comedian from Australia. He loves big things. His brother surprised him with a visit from me for his show that he had out in LA. And here he is wearing World's Largest Things t-shirt, hugging Gary Busey, which is the closest I'm gonna get to Gary Busey. But still pretty great. And that's me in Venice Beach, before it had horns and the full jackalope. So that one did actually make it down to Houston, but I also started traveling with that and a series of sideshow circus wagons that were purpose-built for different shows. So this one is in Sauk County, Wisconsin. So the Wisconsin miniatures are in one circus wagon. All the food-related ones are in the Fabulous Foodstuffs. And then there's a whole bunch of superlatives just from that county. So for a while, I started doing these customized wagons. This one was for Art Prize. So since it was an official art event, I did sculptural superlatives, Michigan marbles, so a whole set of just Michigan environments. And then on the end, there were Art World Wonder Makers. Sculptural superlatives, it was anything that was largest, biggest, tallest, but also deadliest. So I had replicas of art that had inadvertently killed somebody. Or the world's smallest sculpture was really great in that it was never photographed because it was a microscopic sculpture. And the artist was there with a technician with an electron microscope to take the one and only photograph of it. And they were both there looking at the screen and couldn't find the sculpture and couldn't find the sculpture. They zoomed back out, and it turns out the technician had accidentally put his thumb on the slide and destroyed the sculpture forever. So that story was recorded in the sculptural superlatives. Eventually, I always meander back home to Lucas, and in 2017, a local businessman had sold too many properties, so he needed to give one to a nonprofit. Nobody else would take it because it's a building that does not have an adequate roof, but stupid old me said, yeah, I'd love a space. So that has become, and it was full of antiques, so this is how it came to me. First thing I did was rip out the ceilings to expose the 14-foot expanse and timbers, and that has become the new Roadside Sideshow Expo that houses the world's largest collection, the world's smallest versions, the world's largest things. Open April through October. It's a work in progress because it is still not temperature controlled, but it has a big obnoxious mural on the front. The goose isn't really there, that's Photoshop, and so is that, but the others are actually real. And so now I have this standalone place in downtown Lucas. So now that the collection is sort of self-touring. I've gotten to focus on some of the other work. I still do sideshow work, so these are sideshow banners for a Kansas installation of just the Kansas collection in the stripy tent, and then a fortune teller booth in the middle. And we open up every April Fool's Day for the season. So April through October, self-tour. I've also started doing vending machine souvenirs. So I have a new bank of vending machines this year. At the next show is the So Gross. I have a sausage vending machine where there are just loose little Smokies. It's disgusting. I do not encourage you to eat it. There'll also be a fudge vending machine. So as it gets used, they'll sort of pulverize themselves and kind of ooze this disgusting mess that nobody should eat. But I'm doing it for the show, and it's for the show. There's also serious vending going on. But what I'm here to talk about is preserving these environments. So this is my neighbor. The reason I live in Lucas, Kansas is that during these on-the-road years, I stopped through to volunteer. I went to an auction and a house sold for $1,200. And I was like, I'm living in a bus and I could probably find $1,200. So I started asking around, and the house right next door to the Garden of Eden was for sale. It was a little bit more than I wanted to spend, so we negotiated for a while, and right before the California trip in the bus, I bought it over the phone for $4,000 cash. Right next to the garden. It had new roof, had new electric, a 1920s house, and I thought, this is awesome. It's in the middle of the US. It means that in my travels, I can always just sort of circle back to this central location, and it's right next door to this thing that's going to remind me every day that this is the art that impacts normal people. This is the art that can last through the ages. But I still forget it. When I go down to the post office, I walk by and I sometimes don't even see these sculptures, which is just bizarre. So it takes visitors to remind me that this is an amazing place. You guys got to see it on a really cold day going up to Minnesota when it was like 20 degrees out there.
And I came back during the summer when it was not so cold at all.
Yeah, when it was 110. So we get all of it, which also means that the preservation of these are incredibly difficult. So Garden of Eden timeline, created in 1907 to 1932. I ended up moving in about 2003. The second caretakers at that point were starting to realize that they couldn't do a full restoration, so they needed to do something. So they sold the property to Kohler Foundation, and 2011 and 2012 there is a full restoration.
Who were the first caretakers?
The first caretakers were Wayne and Luella Negley. They were locals. Luella Negley was in the Aurora Club, which also started the library, and Wayne Negley owned the hardware store. So this was just two local people seeing that they first bought it as a rental property, and then Luella Negley, they went through the property, took down the trees, and Luella said, we can't rent this out, we need to restore it. So is that split-second moment of realization of this is precious. We can't chop this up. We have to save it. And those first caretakers were doing whatever they could. But we just ran into the Nagley papers at an auction. So they passed away just in the last 5 years. I was at the farm auction, and there was a metal lockbox with a piece of duct tape on top with Garden of Eden papers written in Sharpie on it. And I purchased that box and opened it up, and it was original correspondence of everybody that Wayne had written to and gotten a receipt back from. So Hemphill from the Hemphill collection wrote him back. Seymour Rosen wrote him back. Everybody involved in these sites wrote back to Wayne Negley, and it was in this box that we just happened to get at an auction. So we're now doing an archiving process for that. But this is the reason why it still exists today, because somebody made that decision not to destroy it, not to cut it up into a rental, but they knew what they had, and then they sold it to the second caretakers. So I really got involved in the Garden of Eden in 2011, 2012. and just asked to be a part of the team. And so it was a trial by fire. It was amazing because it is a stone log cabin house with concrete sculptures around that are about populist party politics at the turn of the last century. So not new populism. This was very much growing out of the Farmers Alliance. So he's talking about the bank trusts holding this bag of interest and eating that bag of interest from unregulated bank trusts, but also the tentacles expanding out to engulf the U.S., and one tentacle headed towards the Panama Canal so that it could control transportation routes. That octopus also has a baby in its tentacles to control the woman. It has one tentacle around the waist of the woman. The woman is reaching towards the soldier. The octopus also has a tentacle into the soldier's knapsack to control his food supply, because that's how you control the soldiers. That serviceman is aiming down his gun at the next tree at an Indian who is aiming at the next tree to a dog that's after a fox, that's after a bird, that's after a worm that's eating a leaf. And this whole thing altogether was built to illustrate social Darwinism, which was popular at the time, that said if you are one of the small guys, it is you're going to get eaten by the larger guy, and that's okay. We're all about the big guys eating the small. And this was not what Dinsmore believed, but he wanted to illustrate how society was operating. And then in the backyard, he started erecting sculptures about how to change that. And I pulled those out to kind of move us along a little bit faster. But in the backyard, he has the goddess of liberty slaying that octopus. And on the surrounding trees, he has a woman who is unmarried, he has an immigrant laborer, and he has a black man pointing to liberty, all with lights of illumination and a path to liberty, showing that the populists at that time were really wanting to make sure that everybody had a voice and had a way to get to that equality platform. So it's a powerful site. Built at the turn of the last century. He died in 1928 or 1932 and is interred in his mausoleum. His second wife was 60 some odd years younger than he was, and she managed the site for a while with her new husband until World War II broke out, and then it became locals. But when we're talking about the restoration, these are 3-story tall sculptures that are 100 years old. So it ended up being a bunch of very careful maneuvering. We had lifts for probably 2 months just to clean it. And this is one of the very first things that happens with any of these restorations. You have to clean it to see what's going on. So even in just using a biological cleaner and going top down, oh, that's one of the pointing men. Going top down, you could see from those years of grime the difference. The surfaces had color. We didn't know that. Nobody local had that memory of these being sculptures with color in them. He was mixing white Portland cement and gray Portland cement and a local ironstone that he would grind up and mix in pigment-wise to make this whole range of colors. So she's blushing. She has eyeliner. The eyes are blue. Her dress looks like it's torn, and it's not torn because of neglect, it's torn because he built it that way. He built them naked and then put on a layer of clothes and then put on another layer of clothes with exclusion so you could see through. Here's another just before and after of cleaning. They have eyebrows. The beards are different colors. The lips are different colors. People have pink nipples. There's little scars and bruises on people's knees and elbows. One of the best ones is there's a Cain and Abel, and one of them is the death scene. So Cain had just whacked him over the face with a hoe, and his face is all split open. And when we cleaned it off, there's gore everywhere that drips down his hand onto the sidewalk that we'd never seen before. And this is Cain fleeing the land of Nod, and he still has gore stuck to his face from the murder of his brother. So all of these things were just from cleaning, and that alone took I'd say a month and a half to 2 months just to clean the site one time. And this is something that we likely need to do over and over again. This is another thing we found out. In being up on the lifts and up on the scaffolding, Cain has male pattern baldness. You'd never know that from the ground. So there are all these gems. The baby has a little penis. This is my favorite shot from that restoration site with Pinky, who is now a tattoo artist, helping out with this restoration process. It's just amazing. We would do slow interventions. We'd also make sure that you would always be able to tell what was a repair versus what was original. So you can see here where we are repairing the Indian skirt. They're done with a mesh and then a rough coat and then some semi-match to the red, and that has aged to be closer in texture. But our goal was that from far away you don't see that it's been fixed, but from up close you can immediately tell what parts are our work and what parts were original. And now we know that we should have been documenting a little bit better each time. But for one whole month, we were mixing up cookies of all the possible combinations. So we'd have boards and boards of cookies that we would mix up, put out in little patties, write down the formula, and then after they were cured, pick the cookie that most matched the surface and then use that formula from there. So these are long involved processes, and one of the most important parts is celebrating those wins when you can. So the restoration will never be done, but we did have a giant tent party at the end and have this bright, clean spot full of light until we had a hailstorm in 2015 that took out every light. So this is a never-ending process, and I'm sorry to tell you, Orange Show, it will never end. There's always going to be something. Shortly after that, I found out that there had been another site in Lucas called Roy and Claire Miller's Park. This is a yard environment. They used to travel and pick up rocks. When they could no longer travel, again, World War II kind of put a damper on things. They started collecting their rocks into little mountains and ended up making this little rock museum and park so that people who needed water on their travels could stop. He was also a windmill smith, so there's always fresh water, and they could tour this sort of mini mountain gallery. I had heard tell of this environment, but it had been lost to Lucas once they passed. So in 1969, the whole environment was sold. Nobody in Lucas bid on it because they didn't believe it could be moved. Somebody from Hays, Kansas, about 70 miles away, bid on it and moved it to Hays. It was then an attraction there for a while, and for years everybody was like, we've got to get Miller's Park back. Finally in 2012, I found out who owned it and said, if I could guarantee you somebody will pay to restore them, will you give them back? And he did. So one Christmas, this is what it started out like. Let's get to, these are just great photos. This is where I found it. So it was in a field. This was most of what was left. And so we just started digging out under the edges of these sculptures. They'd been moved a couple times, so things had gotten lost. They'd been abandoned for a series of years, so there was a lot of material loss. And we just went through and did an inventory. So we named each one, we labeled them on a spreadsheet, and then we started sort of digging through the dead grass to see if there's anything that had fallen off. And we put those in containers and make sure that they stayed with our newly established label or number. Then we ended up digging out the foundations, and every time we would dig, we would sift through that soil, find some more minerals and rocks that went with it. And then the ground froze because we were doing this in December and January. We had a hard freeze and ended up having to heat the ground with heat warmers for 2 or 3 days to continue. And then volunteer truckers came to haul everything back to Lucas. It was outside of harvest season, so we had professional excavators lifting them and loading them, but it was volunteer work that got them back. You can see the deterioration on some of these before they moved, but they would get lifted onto the truck, and then we would saran wrap them. And there's Matt starting with some saran wrap. So he would be up in the truck with these big rolls to just make sure that everything stayed on there for that 70-mile trek. And then this was, I think, January 4th. I wanted it to be a Christmas present to Lucas, but it didn't work out. It ended up being a New Year's surprise. But they started rolling in at dawn, and then the factory just showed up with their forklifts to put everything in place. It was so cool. It was just amazing. Oh yeah, so this was the first load that showed up, so that when people woke up that morning, part of their environment was back. These places are magic, people. They really are. So we did have some paid crew, but there are so many volunteers that help make this happen. And they can just look like junk when nobody cares. But all it takes is somebody caring to suddenly have Miller's Park back. I feel bad about what we left behind. We left behind this sort of sad, abandoned amusement park. But Lucas got Miller's Park back, and over the next couple months, we ended up comparing the old photos. So there are a lot of documentation. So for every sculpture that we had a new page in the book of the new photo. And we went through all the histories and found the best photo that we could find so that we could match the angles and see what material we had to have back. And that took probably weeks and weeks of research. But we always had this working binder of, this is what we have, this is from Miller's Park as it was, what can we do to recreate it? So we got these pieces together, again, in a volunteer building with heated floors, and pieced those bases together and then welded up frames underneath, so that from then on, whenever they're lifted, we're lifting by metal, the metal's coated, and the new pads, this is not pads, this is two people unsafely being underneath sculptures, because that's what we do. Sorry, OSHA. Nobody died. There is metal there. We ended up digging out footprints based on what we could reconstruct. And every once in a while pushing the Wisconsin people out with our tractors because they thought they could drive in snow and they still couldn't. We'd also go back to the site and redig once the ground firmed up a little bit. We went out and redug around all of the old bases and got more material back so that we could replace the material that had been lost. The mapping started with trying to recreate a footprint by hand of the original site, and that's what ended up determining the new placement. We'd also send out social media requests for these little Tootsie cars that ended up being things that were part of the environment but lost because kids would grab them. So people sent in their memories, they sent in replacement parts, and eventually we ended up with a footprint that replicated the original Miller's Park, even though we couldn't place it where Miller's Park really was. The local historical society donated historically accurate fencing, and yet more farmers volunteered in putting that fencing up. So once again, a team of people who ranged from a couple of conservators with training to a bunch of locals that care a lot, doing what they can to help a site. The people who knew how to run the augers were the ones running the augers. The people comfortable with cement, we would have a cement day. So it was a lot of training too of locals of how to care for these things, and just showing that you care made that care expand exponentially back into the locals. It's been really great. What I'm supposed to be doing now is reproducing some of these signs, going back into those photographs again and trying to find the right fonts and the right layout. But we've gotten to work on some other restoration work too. This is a site in Georgia, Passaquan. First time I saw it would have been on the left in 2014. Lots of lime leaching up through these painted surfaces. And it's all the work of Eddie Owens Martin. And we ended up relocating to Georgia for 2.5 years. Slowly, at this one, there had been enough of the paint deterioration that we couldn't save any of the painted surface. But one of the very first things that people did there was to go through and take off a chip of paint, flip it over, and find what the color originally had been. Compared that to a Pantone chart, and that ended up being in the record for that sculpture. So this one did end up being a completely repainted one, but based on original color choices. Lots of structure work. So a lot of the work ends up being things that you will never see, but are essential for something continuing going. There wasn't a whole lot of foundation work needed, but the roofs needed some major work. So on the top of this roof over the round part in the back, Eddie Owens Martin had even done the patterning in the roof tiles. So he touched every single bit of this environment. There are hammered metal pieces that go around each and every edge. And so when we started to try to recreate those, we found a tap and die set, and it wasn't working because we were piercing this metal until one of the Passaquan Preservation Society people said, you know what, I have his original tap and die. So we ended up using the block that Eddie used to recreate all the metal pieces, so that the artist hand and the artist tools were the ones that started restoring this site back to what it was going to be. The patterns there are just amazing. It turns out that our restoration work didn't last as long as it should have. So that's another thing that we found out in going through this process. Chemicals change, needs change, materials that you think are going to work sometimes fail because there's one factor that wasn't involved again. So they've redone a lot of their paint material with new chemistry and new research. So again, it's going to be never ending. And it's okay to change the track if it turns out one track is not working. But it always comes back to me for the artist, because these artists are all building these places to have a place to be. Eddie said that he built his place to have something to identify with, because there's nothing I see in this society that I identify with or desire to emulate. Here, I can be in my own world with my temples and designs in the Spirit of God. And that has reverberated through the town. In just the opposite way, one of the most recent ones we've gotten to work on is the sculpture field in Mullinville, Kansas. In my travels, just like always going to see Leonard anytime I went to California, anytime I was in Southwest Kansas, I would stop and see my buddy MT. Because the very first time I met him was during a Rare Visions and Roadside Revelations thing. I was in the bus. It was going to be my first time coming to Houston. Kelly Ludwig it was her first time showing, sort of chauffeuring Rare Visions through this journey. We show up there. It was all MT's day. I tried to not show up until later because the thing was we're going to film a bunch of stuff on sites along the way to make a narrative. I show up in the bus and MT wasn't done yet, and I kind of pissed him off. So when Rare Visions started to ask me some questions, he would just go over to the wall and turn on the train horn. So you couldn't hear or film or see or say anything. And it only took once for me to realize, all right, I've stepped on your toes. I'm sorry. Backing the bus up. So let all of that finish up, and then I went and I apologized. He was like, oh, I'm just doing it for the show. And from then on, we were absolute friends. So every 2 years, I needed my MT fix. He would call me on my bullshit. He would let me know when I was getting too artsy for my own good. He would remind me that art is about real people doing real things, and you do not need to apologize for it. And if you're not making art, why not? And it's your own moral obligation to do this thing.
Did you make any art with him?
I was supposed to. I actually got a grant to make art with him, for him to teach me how to weld. He ended up making me clean his studio. So I never got to make art, but I did clean his studio.
I held something without a mask.
Yeah, I've been there when he's cut stuff out and welded stuff together, but this whole time, and I think it was because it was a grant and that made him mad, and he was like, all right, well, what I really need you to do is clean up that area, and then maybe we'll weld. Oh, well, maybe organize that paint, maybe we'll weld. Maybe do that, and maybe we'll weld. Never got to weld, and I think that's why. But that's fine. That's absolutely fine. He was one of my favorite people. So I was once again very happy to be on that preservation crew, just because I wanted to make sure that that promise made to this artist came to pass. If this site will stay here in Mullinville, we will fix it so that people can continue to enjoy it, even though for me, most of the point was going to visit MT and the sculptures were a bonus. Anybody who ever pissed him off got a totem. Kansas Highway Patrolman who gave him a ticket shortly after got a totem up there. Any sort of political statement that needed to be made, he would make it. Once that political statement was done, he would cannibalize it into something else. So here too, he would document things, but the site would change over and over and over again. So since I'd been seeing him for 15 years and photographing, I brought all of my archives of this is this sculpture 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 2 years to now. And that ended up driving our decisions of where to restore to for certain pieces. There's painted surface, there are whirligigs that do want to kill you. Some of these, there's one called the blender sculpture, because when the Kansas wind was blowing, you could hear it slice like a horror show knife. It was just going, wah, wah, and it would bang you on the head. We had one conservator who did need stitches because he didn't pay attention to the wind and didn't pay attention to the whirligig, and MT let him know. And MT did his own documenting. So in addition to all of the stuff that we brought with us to the site, he had taken photographs of everything, named everything, maybe not appropriately. I had no idea what Baltimore Museum was, but it turns out it was AVAM because he sent pieces there. None of us knew that. And then suddenly, we knew what this big pile was. When they came back from the Visionary Art Museum, he just threw them in the field. So there was this one pile that was all Visionary Art Museum work. And it was because of this folder that was like, oh, that's where this goes. So finally we could reconstruct it. Or whenever we had most of a piece, we'd always compare it to the photographs that he was taking so we would know what's missing. So that on the original photo, there's a little guy sticking up out of the toilet. We looked for that and looked for that and looked for that. Finally decided, all right, we've got to make a replica because it needs to be a part of it. Made the replica, and the next day found the piece in the grass. So you have to sometimes make it, and then the earth just gives the pieces back. So we scrapped the replica and put the real one back on there. And so they're, again, never-ending sites. This was one of the AVAM ones that came out of the field. Whenever MT got a bigger crane truck, he made taller pieces. But even now, this is one of the blender pieces that flew off in the wind. We had a 100-mile-per-hour windstorm, and the thing that you do the very next day after every windstorm is walk the line and note which sculptures have broken, bring those in, try to find as many pieces as you can, and keep it going. We did a lot of in-the-field work. We only started one grass fire, but all of it came back to making sure that MT's voice is there and is primary. We didn't edit them, which also is one of those topics that we still need to address, is how do you address some of the problematic language and problematic signatures and stay true to somebody's vision? And that is like an ongoing conversation that we all will continue to have. Right now, Matt and I are working on Florence Stiebel's yard environment in Lucas, and I'll try to go through this one pretty quickly, but she passed in '99. gave the site to the Grassroots Arts Center, and we knew that we couldn't afford to fix it without help. So we got it listed on the National Register, not just to preserve it, but also to access a new funding stream. So there's some historic preservation work that can only be done for listed environments. The state of Kansas has that. So we got it listed, and the very next year we ended up starting on our preservation plan and building a path to get funding to do a restoration. So we're in the middle of that now. This is one of the rare female-built environments that still exists. The oldest environment in the nation, Laura Pope Forester, is also a female-built environment. We used to say the Garden of Eden was the oldest, but Laura Pope Forester beat us by 4 years. So, oldest in the nation, female builder. Her backyard environment is a very sweet one. She wanted to bring the mountains back home to Kansas. And then when she stopped being able to sculpt, she started purchasing commercial sculpture and then relabeling it. So she would get a statue of Pan and name it Dinsmore and put it up in a Lucas Mount Rushmore. Or Banker Dewey, I think, is represented by Aristotle, and she would buy this commercial sculpture, set it in cement, and then write his name in. Or on the little sort of things going across like that, those are brass rulers that she could order from a mail order catalog, and she'd put like 6 words on there, but order 30 rulers, so that 6 words at a time, she tells the history of Lucas, and then embedded that in cement. So this is like a little Lucas record. And for this one too, Pete and I just yesterday went through the Orange Show and started trying to map out where each sculpture begins and ends. And this was our first step in creating a preservation plan for the Diebel Yard. We had to not just name the sculptures and create a record for that, but decide, all right, since these are all melded together in a mountain, where's the boundary and where's the border? So that when we're talking to each other restoration-wise, we know that 022 is only the pond area and it ends at the seam in the pond, and we can be very specific about our language to talk about what we need to do, but also in limiting our scope sculpture by sculpture by sculpture. It also helps in billing. And the second thing we did was go through and find every historic photo that we could so we could compare 1977 to the state it was in 2018. And these end up being such important parts of the record because in this shot that is a great portrait of Florence Diebel, it also shows sort of 3 swans and 3 boats and a little snack area. When we got there, the trees had grown up that so far that you didn't know there were boats there. They'd almost swallowed the geese. So using that photo, we knew how much had been encroached upon and how much we needed to clear away. And this also gives us clues whenever we find rubble, whenever it was cared for in a sort of slipshod manner. If something broke, one of the caretakers used to just throw it into the bush. So as we were trimming the bush, we were finding the sculpture pieces and being able to bring them back forward. And it wasn't done meanly. It was done because sometimes these don't have that treasured status that a Donald Judd sculpture might. And people don't treat them preciously like art objects in museums. So it wasn't ever done maliciously. It was just this is starting to look bad. Let's clear the clutter away and just throw it somewhere else. We are glad that they threw it close. We are glad that it didn't get removed completely. We are super glad when we find these things, these treasures, and then with a photo can figure out where they go. So there's a lot of things that I wish would happen differently, but there is so much saved because somebody was too lazy to take it to the dump. And I love that. So this is the current project. It's not in too bad of a shape. We've got a lot of foundation issues to do because there's a storm cellar that goes under one of them, and you can see that wall separation. So we've already got the subcontractor, Mason, has already addressed that part. So now that the structure is done, we can go back and readdress the top part. But that top part still started with cleaning, started with collecting, And now we have that long, hard road of getting it from pre-hailstorm, comparing it to the structural images that are the earliest that we can be found. This is how we found it when we started. We did have a hailstorm that 2007, you can see the damage to 2018. From 2018 to the time that we got to remove it in 2020, even more of that head is gone. So it's not just restoration of the site, we end up having to do restoration of these objects. Or hailstorm broke some of the parts and pieces that the only way that we're going to be able to replace this is probably with a new one, although her hand is there in the corner. So we found a lot of parts of her, but it might make more sense to just buy another one and replace it. So for this one, since it is a historic site, we are going back to National Park Service guidelines, and they have a lot of resources on their sites for how to document what philosophy to go forward with. But it still doesn't cover everything, and that again is going to be that continuing conversation of, all right, do you do it to museum standard? Do you do it to historic preservation standard? Or is the artist's vision primary? And none of these are yes or no's. They're all degrees. So the artist's voice might have to be primary for one, but in another one, it might have to be a preservation standard that trumps her just a little bit. So we have these conversations a lot. My last project right now, purchased a building in 2020 to house these archives. So now all of these conservation notes that Matt and I have been taking for the last 5 projects and what I'm gathering from here on out are now going to be housed at the old library building. This is the storefront improvement grant that I just got, so eventually it'll look maybe like this, but probably a little crazier, but this is what I had to show them to get money. And this ends up being right across the street from the expo, but is open to anybody who is in the same field so that we can start sharing these resources and start sharing these ways of looking and seeing so that you're not relearning the same things. There's already people out there doing it and trying to figure out where the pitfalls are. And we're starting that network of site stewards that have these same concerns and really starting a sharing of knowledge. And that is how I got here. Thank you. Nice to see you. So,
questions?
Yeah, questions? Thoughts about building your own environments? Have you retained any of the art cars that you build, or are you smart enough to make sure that they get housed and you don't have to deal with it?
They get housed, I don't have to deal with it. Most of them, I don't know, the first 20, 15 maybe, I've done 30 plus of them, so they get housed. They go somewhere.
Good. Because those two are objects that are going to be not like any others. And museum preservation isn't quite the same as art car preservation because, again, it's about the idea and about the form.
What year did the rock one start?
So they started building in the 1930s and 40s, and then when they died in, I think, 1968 and 69. So that site was gone before I was even born, but it was so vivid in locals' memory that when I started talking to Lucas, everybody remembered it like yesterday.
Because when I saw it, the pictures, I was like, oh, that reminds me of Peterson's Rock Garden in Bend, Oregon. And I was like, oh, I wonder if they had seen that.
Or any of the grottos.
What?
Or any of the grottos. Because like the Dauberstein Grotto and the Grotto of the Redemption too.
I just looked up Peterson and it was like, oh, it started in the 1900s. I was like, oh, maybe.
They could have, because they traveled a lot. And I saw some postcards from some other place in Phillipsburg, Kansas that also had little mini mountains of materials. So it seems like there is this like 1900s to 1950s craze of putting rocks in conical form, or making little mini villages out of rocks and collections.
Europeans love mini villages.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and those are so much fun
Yeah.
because you can stomp around like a monster. For those, we do still have piles that we know were from Miller's Park but haven't figured out how to recreate part of it. So we do, if the footprint didn't have the sculpture that was whole, the footprint ends up being a holding place for materials that we know went with Royal Gorge. So this sort of iconic one, most of those rocks didn't make the move to Hayes. Very few made it back, but the ones that we know were part of it are now part of that whole, and will likely be replaced with that sort of image just as a placeholder, because you can't save everything, especially if it's been moved.
So as you know, each year it seems like we're losing artists after artists, and it doesn't appear to be a replacement generation quite of the same force that we've seen in the past. I guess my question to you is, when I've visited artists, I'm always torn between just having a nice visit versus wanting to fully document a site or asking a whole bunch of kind of biographical questions. What's been your experience with?
Where's that? There's been years where I decide not to bring a camera, and I always regret it. But I think, especially with MT, the years that I photographed were the years where he wasn't there. So it'd be more like you'd have this very intense artist visit where I wouldn't take any photos at all. But then the next time I came through, if he wasn't there and I couldn't talk to him, I would spend the day just going up and down. But I think it is a hard balance, because especially as soon as there's a camera there, there's a barrier that I think even the artists know that something's different and it's not a person-to-person communication. But I think there are photographers who do that really well, like Fred Scruton.
Right.
He ends up being able to engage so fully because of his camera and the way that he uses it as a tool to connect, not a tool to sort of sterilize something, is much different. So I never got to that point where I could feel like an artist visit was the same as documenting visit, which is why I keep going back to places. I go to things 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 times.
That's huge, and I love revisiting artists if they're not there at the sites to see how they've changed.
Yeah. And a friend of a friend once said, "Oh, I've seen that once. Why would I need to go again?" And it was such a foreign concept. It was like, well, there might be something different, and like, did you connect with that person? And ideally, that's a friend, and why wouldn't you want to go visit your friend again? And how can it just be this thing that you dismiss as a one time is enough? And that to me sort of illustrated the crackness of these sites and how pure and fresh and wonderful they are, because they are so living and breathing, especially when the people are living and breathing. And they're so preciously not precious that I feel like I need to absorb as much of it as I can every single time, because they could go away like that, and they do. And then it's like, oh, I wish I would have climbed the treehouse when I could have. As opposed to, I did climb the treehouse, and I probably shouldn't have, but I'm so glad I did, because the next time it had burned, and then 3 weeks later it was gone. So, do it while you can. There is no tomorrow. Unless you're preserving, then yes, think about the future. Yes, think about the future, folks, even when you're building. So, legacy-wise, though, MT thought about this a lot before he died. So he made sure to have caretakers in place. He made sure to have records in place. He made sure to have a plan of how to fund that transfer. So as an artist building an environment, knowing about other environments and knowing the problems with other environments, he took a lot of steps early to make sure that even if the town didn't want it, which they do now, and enough people did that you can't say that Mullenville didn't want it. There were just a couple people who didn't want it. He knew that he had enough balls that were ready to roll as soon as he died that he could be sure that it was going to happen. So, yeah, we are going to trek over to the Orange Show for some structured looking. Anybody who wants to join in and just help us map a few walls materials wise, we're going to do just a very quick little primer of how to take a wall inventory that will be the start of what the Orange Show needs to keep track of surfaces as a restoration starts on the Orange Show, and how to create that baseline record so that if anything would ever happen, you've at least got the images, you've at least got the notes, and you know where to start, because we find that we don't remember things as vividly as we hope when you're working on it. So starting with that mental map, the visual map, and the written map of the site is key to keeping these things going. So we'll start with working area. So whatever is on the tape, we'll put into there. And then that's where we'll start just going top to bottom. So hopefully they're pretty visible. So for the Oasis, we've labeled this one Oasis Facade. And that's what would go in that top line. And then just going from top down, you could even start with that roof material. What do you see and in what order? And so here where the Oasis kind of sticks out in front, it still doesn't really start until here. So I would do that layer, that layer, that layer, and then this layer as a projection. And I think we were conceiving this wall to go wherever that main structure is. It'll end here. So the columns, you might have to go left to right. And it'll end at this column, since that's part of something else. It's just going layer by layer. And then once that one's done, moving inside, we have Oasis Facade Rear, so it's kind of that same thing. It shouldn't be much different, but some have tiles on the inside. And then going clockwise, here is Oasis 1, and that's pretty minimal. Oasis 2, and Oasis 3. And we've gone through and marked, I think this one, the gift shop, ladies' room if you want something complex, and there are some more complex areas as we go. But so just
Start with that.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So this has been a great visit. I've been here for 3 days, and I think the last time that I came through would have been likely 2016. So it's been at least 5 years. And you can see the wear and tear. You can see cracks that are expanding. You can see repairs that were hurriedly done. And I don't want to say that as a negative, because this site has been here for 50 years in a town and an environment that wants to eat things up. You fought for your space, and if you lay a piece of wood on the ground here, it's gonna rot within a week. So to have this continual struggle for this site successfully still standing up after 50 years is amazing. So the superficial things are exactly that, superficial. And I am incredibly optimistic about the structural problems that can now be addressed with a massive campaign. So the surface work is continual, will always need to be done, and will always be that ebb and flow. Some areas are wouldn't have happened without this previous 50 years of caretaking by the countless volunteers who've been through this site.
Yeah. And can you talk about the utility of volunteer work compared to a more professional level of, the engineers getting in here?
So, for each of our sites, there are always volunteers who want to be involved. And for some tasks, that is not feasible. For other tasks, it is. So for mapping surfaces, for doing general cleanup with proper training, which can be a brief tutorial at the beginning of a workday, and checking to make sure it's being done, but then trusting volunteers to do that task that's very clearly lined out. That's how you do long-term maintenance, because you're not always going to be able to have the funds for a big conservation crew all at once. And especially for sites that are open to the public, your docents are also de facto conservationists, preservationists. The people coming through have to know a little bit more about not just the site as a concept, but also the physical nature of the site, so then they too know how to act within the site. And if they see a tile, not to put it in their pocket, but to put it up on the thing or hand it to the docent and tell them where they got it.
Yep.
So all of these need to work together in that larger plan, because the volunteers are the way that you connect to community. It's the way that you give ownership of this site to the people who come through. And that's how these sites remain connected to their community and not isolated within some sort of sterile structure.
Great. And you've thought about these kinds of sites around the country, perhaps as much as anybody else. How does the Orange Show stack up against these other sites in terms of national importance, longevity, really along any lines that you can think of?
Well, national importance, it's in my top 10. It's in a lot of people's top 10s of self-made worlds. I happen to caretake the Garden of Eden, also one of those top 10 sites, second oldest in the nation. Not sure where you are in the ages of sites that have made it, but you are entering into antique zone. So this is a legacy site, and everybody who comes here, everybody who studies folk art, traditional art, artist-built environments, comes here as one of those mega sites. Preservation-wise, you guys have had hands on it every single day for 50 years. And some of the rural sites don't have that option. They don't have the people or the care or the institutions nearby to help caretake. Some of the other rural sites don't get as much wear though, because they are maybe more remote and a little more protected. So each one is individual. It's hard to stack it up, but it's, again, a top 10 for me.
Great. Anything else you want to say about your visit this week?
What I love about revisiting sites is to see something again and remember that wonder of the first time. Because there's always a moment going through where you're just all the way there. And you can't always get that with a crowd. You can't always get that with one visit. And that's the reason that you come again and again and again and again. So this has been great to connect to the site on a much deeper level, because this was the focus.
All right. Thank you, Erika Nelson.
You are welcome.